Hello, boys. It's time for our story time together, and I've chosen a lovely story for you. It's called The King of Capri. And while it isn't filled with knights and castles, the story, there is a king. He lives in a castle, and there's a girl. So it's probably going to be a love story. It's a beautiful story of fortunes changed and reversed and romance found in a delightful story. And it all happens when a wind blows the king's precious treasures off his balcony and across the Bay of Naples. Let's find out. The King of Capri. Imagine a very rich king living in Capri and some very poor people living in Naples. Imagine what would happen if all the rich king's precious things were blown in a very bad storm across the sea to Naples, where they landed in the backyard of a washerwoman, Mrs. Jewell. How would everything work out? It's written by Jeanette Winterston and it's illustrated by Jane Ray. And here is the king, and he's standing on the balcony of his palace, of his castle. And he lives in an island of Capri, and he dedicated the book to his beautiful godchild and for his friends. And it's called The King of Capri. There's even a pair of brookies hanging off that duck, so you can know it's got something to do with washing and eating and pots. The King of Capri had been out to a party. It was just the kind of party that kings like best. All his friends were there, and somebody had cooked his favourite food. There was royal jelly, crown of lamb, queen of puddings, buns with pearly icing, and chocolate soldiers. The king ate as much as he could, but not as much as he would have liked. He had a bun in one hand, jelly in the other hand, but try as he might, he couldn't get all the jelly and all the bun into his mouth at once. "Why have I got two hands, but only one mouth?" wondered the king. His adviser stood nearby and said, "Sire, think of all the poor people in your kingdom. They can hardly feed one mouth each. However could they feed two?" But the king never did think about the poor people. He always thought only about himself. What an amazing kingly feast. Oh, my word, it's true. He's naked. Let's hope he doesn't turn around. It was midnight when the king got back to his palace. All his servants were asleep. The king looked at himself in the mirror and saw that he was covered in ice cream and treacle and egg sandwich and orange juice and bits of banana. "If I had 2 mouths," he said to himself, "I wouldn't be in this mess. How can anybody be expected to get all their food into just one mouth?" Well, what could he do? So he took off all his dirty clothes, and except for his socks and his crown, then he padded out onto the balcony and pegged his clothes on the line. He had often seen clothes hanging on the line, and he didn't know what they were there for, and that he had to wash them first. But the king got into his bed and fell asleep. Now, Capri is an island, and the king's palace sat high up on a cliff that looked out to sea. Very often the king would lean on his balcony and he would admire the view over the Bay of Naples. Across the bay was the city of Naples, where a lot of poor people lived. And the poorest of them all was a washerwoman called Mrs. Jewell. Now, a washerwoman is somebody who washed clothes for other people. Nowadays we talk about it as a laundry, somebody who does your laundry. And that was the way she earned her money. If you went to Mrs. Jewell's house to look for her, you wouldn't be able to see her. For a start, Mrs. Jewell was very small. Here she is. And her tiny house was full of steam. This was because she did all her washing in a great big boiler, and all day long the boiler boiled and boiled and boiled, while Mrs. Jewell threw in the dirty clothes, hauled out the clean ones, and never got her head out of the steam. There were people who had known her for years and had absolutely no idea what she looked like. All they ever saw was a little column of steam moving about. Through the big columns of steam, Mrs. Jewell had a cat. The cat was called Wash. She was a washerwoman, and so the cat was called Wash. You can see her feet and this pillar of steam that was all about her. There's her washing. And the washing of people that she was washing, doing their laundry for. It was midnight. Mrs. Jewel and Miss and Wash had just finished their supper, and Mrs. Jewel had eaten a chicken wing and 19 baked beans. Shame, she had counted them out. A tomato and half a slice of bread, and then they were going to share a cup of milk. Very different, from what the King of Capri had had for supper. 2 mouths to feed Wash, said Mrs. Jewel, but only 1 supper. That's opposite, to the king. Wash rubbed his head against her hand. He was the thinnest cat in the world. He was so thin that if he swallowed a mouse, it made a big bulge in his tummy. It was like carrying a tennis ball in your pocket. No matter how hard Mrs. Jewel worked, she never had enough money because although everyone wanted clean clothes, no one wanted to pay much for them. Never mind, she thought, I will do my best, and someday all this will change. She's a kind soul. That night, a great tempest blew in across the sea. A tempest is a synonym for wind, almost like, not quite a hurricane, but not a tornado either, but a very, very strong wind. On Capri, where the king was snoring loudly in his crown and just his socks, the first thing that the wind did was to blow the peaked caps off the palace guards. The second thing that the wind did was to blow the birds out of the trees. The third thing that the wind did was to blow all the deck chairs off the beach. And the fourth thing that the wind did was to blow the hands off the church clock. And the fifth thing the wind did was to blow the moustaches off the night watchman. And the sixth thing that the wind did was to blow the wigs off the ladies in waiting. And the seventh thing that the wind did was to blow the pajamas off all the king's men. Maybe it was a tornado. And the eighth thing that the wind did was to blow all the milk out of the cows. Wow. And the ninth thing that the wind did was to blow all the king's clothes off his balcony. Who thinks they know where they're going to land up, those clothes? Remember, his palace, his castle, overlooks the Bay of Naples, and Mrs. Jewel lives on the other side of the bay. If you had looked over the Bay of Naples at night, you would have seen the king's velvet breeches, those are his trousers, and the king's silk shirt, and the king's golden waistcoat, and the king's embroidered cloak, or flying across the sea. And where do you think they landed? They landed on Mrs. Jewel's washing line. But she doesn't know that yet. She was fast asleep as well. Never in all the history of Capri had there been such a wind. Everyone was woken up except for the king, because he was so fat and so weighed down with buns and jelly that even a tempest couldn't do much as blow his hair across the pillow. Perhaps that was also because his hair was stuck to the pillow with a jam sandwich he had kept underneath it at night, just in case he got hungry. And by morning the news was out. Every single thing in Capri, every pot, pan, coat hanger, chicken, lottery ticket had been blown away. And where do you think they had all landed? It was Wash who found them first. Wash had woken up on a pile of towels where he was supposed to be sleeping. He yawned and stretched himself, and as it was daylight, he thought he'd go for a walk outside. Mrs. Jewel had a big backyard where she dried all her laundry, and when Wash had finished walking and sniffing and rolling and looking at all the things that cats like to do, he lay down high up on the wall, his body as orange as the sun, and his eyes like 2 golden coins. The wind was outside. "Good morning, Wash," said the wind. "Buongiorno," said Wash, by which Italian cats mean good morning. I had a bit of a night last night, said the wind. I'm sorry about all the stuff in your backyard. Non si dice, said Wash, who wasn't taking any notice, and he just said, don't mention it. I can't really read Italian, so I don't know if I've read that nicely. Then Wash looked. What? And then he looked again. Then he looked again and again, and it looked as if the whole world had piled itself up in Mrs. Jewel's backyard. There was a bed with somebody still asleep in it. On top of the bed was a cow. On top of the cow was a vacuum cleaner. On top of the vacuum cleaner was a bicycle. That's the one that we saw at the beginning. On top of the bicycle was a box of apples. On top of the apples was a duck. On top of the duck was a pair of knickers. We were right. I called them brookies. A pair of knickers. And on top of the pair of knickers was a big pan of chicken soup. I'll eat that, said Wash. He climbed up, and while he was slurping from the pan, he realized that everything he had ever seen in his life was piled up in the backyard. I didn't know where else to put it, said the wind. You do these things in a moment of madness, and then you left with the mess. But Wash didn't answer because he was too busy eating. I'll clear it up later, said the wind. Goodbye, Wash. Ciao, said Wash, by which Italian cats mean goodbye. The wind flew off and everything was very still. And when Mrs. Jewel came out with her first bit of laundry, she saw Wash, round as a ball and fast asleep on a pair of knickers, and she saw that the whole world was indeed in her backyard. Well, I'm blowed, she said. Now, Wash and Mrs. Jewel were rich. They had everything they needed. But best of all, Mrs. Jewel had a new suit of clothes. These are fit for a king, she said, when she saw the velvet breeches, the silk shirt, the gold waistcoat, and the embroidered cloak. And she soon had the stains out, and when she put on the clothes, she looked like, well, what do you think she looked like? Yes, she looked like a queen. And news soon spread that there was a queen who had come to Naples, who had all the treasure in the world in her backyard. And every morning she sat on an upturned laundry basket and graciously received her visitors. Very different from the king, hey? Remember, the king only thought about himself. To the rich she gave advice, and to the poor she gave money. She had plenty of money because Wash had found the king's treasure chest underneath a box of fish. But what of the King of Capri? Well, he and everybody who lived on the island were now as poor as the people at Naples, as the people of Naples had been before the wind blew everything across the sea. The king had nothing to wear but his socks and his crown and an old dressing gown that belonged to the gardener. He had nothing to eat either, except what he could grow in the garden or catch from the sea. All his servants and all his friends gradually left him, one by one. To work for the Queen of Naples, for she was building a palace in her backyard. Soon the king was the only person left on the island. He was lonely, he was sad, and he had got very thin. How glad I am that I have only one mouth to feed, he said to himself. If I had 2 mouths, I should be twice as hungry. And he thought of all the food he had wasted and thrown away, and of the many times he had refused to give the beggars anything to eat. Things have changed, eh? Look here, he's fishing for food off his balcony of his castle. Then one day, when the king's plate was empty, he swallowed his pride, and he rowed across the bay to see the Queen of Naples. How splendid everything looked on the glittering coastline. There were now market stalls, they were selling fresh bread, and there were people running about building things and making things. Everyone seemed happy and full. When he asked the way to the Queen's house, they told him how good and kind and generous she was, and the king remembered that no one had ever said that about him. He came to the marvellous palace, and there was an enormous orange cat, that's Wash, sitting on the front step. "Is the Queen at home?" asked the king. Si, said Wash, by which Italian cats mean yes, yes, yes. And the king could hear everybody singing. They were so happy. He went around to the back, and there was Mrs. Jewel, who was now known as the Queen of Naples, standing over a steaming tub and washing her nightdress. "Have you no servants?" asked the king. "Hundreds," said the Queen. "But where's the fun in that?" "I used to have servants once," said the king. Then he looked closely at Mrs. Jewel. "Come to think of it, I used to have a suit of clothes, just like the ones you're wearing." "What, just like these?" asked the Queen. "Well, mine had a few stains on them, it's true." And then the king told the story of how every single thing on his island had been blown away by a tempest. "Wash!" shouted the Queen. "Come here. Do you know anything about a tempest?" Wash slunk around the corner, and he had to tell the whole story about how the wind had dropped everything from Capri into Mrs. Jewel's backyard, including the king's clothes. "Well, you better take it all back then, hadn't you?" said Mrs. Jewel to the king. "But what would you do then?" asked the king. "Oh, I'd go back to the laundry business, I suppose," said Mrs. Jewel. "Only I wouldn't want Wash to be hungry again." The king was silent for a while, and while he was silent, he was looking at the sunshine and the flowers and wondering why he never used to look at them before. Then he looked at Mrs. Jewel and thought she was as lovely as sunshine and flowers, and that if she were with him, he would be happy and good for the rest of his life. He said, "When I was King of Capri, I used to long for 2 mouths so that I could eat twice as much. I should like 2 mouths now, my own and yours to talk to me. My own and yours to smile at me. My own and yours to kiss good morning and to kiss good night." And the king asked Mrs. Jewel to marry him. And what do you think she said? Here's the love story part. Hey, boys. The king and Mrs. Jewel were married in the greatest style, and everyone from Naples and Capri was invited, and everyone had enough to eat and a present to take home. And the best guest of all was Wash's old friend, the wind, who carefully blew everybody's possessions back to the right place, so that the bed went back to the bedroom, and the cow went back to her field, and the vacuum cleaner went back to the cupboard, and the bicycle went riding down the road, and the apples, well, they had to be eaten, and the duck went back to her pond, and the knickers went back in the drawer, and the pan of soup, well, that had to be eaten too. And Wash, who had eaten it on the very first morning when the wind made a queen of Mrs. Jewel, licked his lips and lay on the wall, his fur as orange as the sun, and his eyes like 2 gold coins. That's the end. And, as a fairy story always ends, they lived happily ever after. Boys, did you know that ending was going to happen? I think you did. It was a lovely story. Thank you for listening, and have a lovely finish to your Wednesday.